Hello friends, and welcome to a new podcast. I know how it is important for other people to learn history of their land, to learn history of their past, and today we are bringing a new segment called This Week in History that will be focusing on historical events that happened in South Africa, corresponding, of course, with our current date. I'll be covering the events that happened from 28th of March to the 3rd of April this week. I do have a suspicion that these podcasts may be way too long than I intended them to be. If that happens, we will then cut them into shorter podcasts. And if you want them to be shorter, please do tell me under the comment section, and do also drop a like and also subscribe. And also, speaking of subscribing, I would like to thank those who have subscribed, viewed, and liked my first video on this channel. It is very appreciated. It shows support, and I'm very thankful and appreciate it. Without any further ado, let's get into the events that took place this week. Starting on the 28th of March, the year is 1960. Oliver Reginald Tambo left South Africa shortly after the Sharpeville massacre. On the instruction of the African National Congress, the international world strongly sympathized with South Africa in the aftermath of the massacre. Tambo left the country illegally to continue with the struggle from exile. When he left alone, and arrangements were then made for his wife Adelaide and his children to follow. Once they reached London, they initially stayed with the South African exile called James Philip. Soon thereafter, they moved into a small flat, and Adelaide found a job as a nurse. The family then returned to South Africa in 1990. This was 4 years before the democratic elections. On the 28th of March 1924, Netu Benya was a political activist who was first active in India, resisting British rule, and later came to South Africa, resisting against the apartheid government. He was born at Coldmoor Road, Bel Air, Durban. In South Africa, he was a member of the African National Congress, ANC, South African Communist Party, SACP, and Umkhonto weSizwe, MK, and served 16 years on Robben Island. Benya passed away on the 1st of January 1999 at the age of 75. On the 28th of March 1982, the Armstrong chairman announces the production of a 155mm artillery piece that outraged its counterparts of a similar caliber by at least 50%, a very, very huge margin. The development of the G5 Howitzer was the direct result of the arms embargo imposed on South Africa due to its apartheid policies and due to the performance of the South African military hardware in action, especially artillery and air support. The hardware shortcomings hampered the army's effectiveness, specifically in terms of the range of artillery utilized. This shortcoming was most evident during the Battle of Kwaito Carnival, when South African military and artillery forces lacked the range to accurately hit their targets. The South African Arms Corporation, Armscor, therefore set out to develop a 155mm artillery piece that could engage enemy forces at considerable distance and was highly mobile. The reason for this choice of caliber was that smaller calibers lacked the penetrating power and range, and that the weight of the projectiles of larger calibers reduced their mobility. The initial design was strongly influenced by the work of a Canadian engineer called Gerald Bull. However, the South Africans refined the design to such an extent that like Bull's initial concept. 28th of March 1994, a very historical year for South Africa, as most of us know. The African National Congress security guards at Shell House in 1994 killed 19 Inkatha Freedom Party IFP members following a tip-off that IFP marchers were planning to attack the building. The Naked Commission of Inquiry on what actually caused the shooting rejected this explanation. The Commission's conclusion was that the shooting by ANC guards was unjustified. Shell House in Jeppe Street, Johannesburg, was home to the ANC after the organization was unbanned. This incident reflected the rising tensions between the ANC and IFP, which had begun in the 1980s in KwaZulu-Natal and had then spread to other provinces in the 1990s. The IFP claimed that the ANC was intent on undermining traditional authorities and the power of Zulu chiefs. The ANC saw it as a power struggle as the demise of apartheid was finalized. The IFP is based on the Zulu cultural organization formed in the 1920s, originally only called Inkatha. The Zulu word means grass coil, and has come to be associated with powerful cultural connotations of Zulu identity. The initial aim was to restore the Zulu kingdom and the land lost as a result of colonization. In 1996, the IFP commemorates shell house shootings. Thousands of Inkatha Freedom Party supporters marched through the streets of Johannesburg to mark the anniversary of the 1994 shell house shootings, during which 8 IFP supporters were killed. The threat of demonstrators to defy a government ban on the carrying of traditional weapons, while police had stated the intention to enforce the ban, raised fears of clashes between police and demonstrators. But in the face of the huge crowds, the police relented and allowed demonstrators to brandish banned weapons. 1996. Following a decision by the Finance Minister Chris Lindbergh to relinquish his cabinet post for private reasons, President Nelson Mandela announced changes to the Government of National Unity. Lindbergh's resignation took effect on the 4th of April, the end of the 1995-1996 financial year. The non-aligned Lindbergh had replaced Derek Keyes from the private sector when he joined the government in 1994. He was replaced by Trevor Manuel, who was then the Minister of Trade and Industry and Tourism. Alec Erwin was promoted to Manuel's post, and Gil Marcus became a Deputy Minister of Finance. The reshuffling also saw Jay Naidoo replacing Paulo Jordan, who was dropped as Minister of Post and Telecommunications. On March 1979, the World Campaign Against Military and Nuclear Collaboration with South Africa was launched in Oslo, Norway. The initiative enjoyed the support of the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid. Several heads of state and government were its patrons, and Ambassador Abdul Samad Munti was the director. In 1966, the trial of Fred Keesing, a listed communist member of the banned South African Communist Party (SACP) and former editor of The New Age, began at the Supreme Court in Cape Town. Keesing faced 3 counts of sabotage and contravention of the Suppression of Communism Act. On 25 May, Keesing was sentenced to a total of 5 years and 9 months imprisonment. After nearly 7 years in prison, Keesing was to join his family in London. Eventually, he was employed at the National Union of Teachers in London. The Keesings returned to South Africa in 1991 and settled in Cape Town. Fred became a local councillor and the treasurer of the SACP in the province. He died on 8th September 2000 in Cape Town. In 1658, the first enslaved people arrived in Cape Town. On this day, the Dutch East India Company VOC ship, the Amersfoort, dropped anchor in the Table Bay. In her hold, she had human cargo. The ship was referred as female. She had 174 slaves. This was the first shipment of slaves to arrive in South Africa and marked the beginning of almost 200 years of slave trade at the Cape. The Amersfoort was not a slaver but a merchant vessel. She was on a journey from the Netherlands to the Cape when she came across a Portuguese slaver heading to Brazil. The Portuguese slaver was coming from the Angolan coast, where they had picked up 500 slaves. The Amersfoort intercepted the slaver and captured half her cargo, taking 250 slaves as a bounty price. Again, please note that these ships were referred to as females, as today you may hear people calling their cars their little babies or their honeys. This is the same reference as well to those ships. The journal entry from Van Riebeeck's journal for 28th of March reads, in 12 dgs latitude, or 12 degrees south latitude, the Amersfoort had captured a Portuguese slaver coming from Angola and proceeding to the Bay Torte Las Santos, present day as known as Salvador, Brazil. with 500 male and female slaves on board. The Amersfoort had taken off 250 slaves and left the rest in the Portuguese ship, which was old and unserviceable. Some were falling ill and dying owing to the long duration of the voyage. The weakest sailors were brought offshore to be refreshed, and also the slaves who had been taken off the Portuguese ship on the coast of April in 12 degrees south latitude and had been reduced by death to 170, of whom many were very ill. The majority of the slaves are young boys, or were young boys and girls, who will be of little use to the next 4 or 5 years. This is according to Jan van Riebeeck's entry. Van Riebeeck had long been clamoring for the need for slaves at the Cape, as he was convinced that the only way to make the settlement truly successful was through the use of cheap slave labor. A small number of slaves had already reached the Cape through various means, but Van Riebeeck wanted to establish a fully fledged slave trade network with Madagascar. He had sent many letters to the Herren XV, or the Herren XVII, the board of directors of the VOC, begging them to supply him with ships to start a slave trade, but the Herren organization consistently refused his request. By 1657, the Herren XV finally conceded to Van Riebeeck's calls and sent him 2 ships to use as slavers. But before either of these 2 ships could arrive at the Cape, the Amersfoort had by chance intercepted the Portuguese slaver and brought her bounty to the settlement. The first shipment of slaves at the Cape was brought there not by design, but by a chance encounter of the open seas. Most of the slaves brought on the Amersfoort were children. In order to occupy these children and give them some basic Christian education, it was decided to open up a school for them. This meant that the first school ever to be opened in South Africa was in fact a school for slave children. The entry from Van Riebeeck's journal on the school, 17 April 1658, read as follows. Arrangements were started for establishing a school for the company's male and female slaves brought here from Angola by the Amersfoort, which has taken them off a prize Portuguese slaver. The sick comforter Peter van der Staal, Jan van Riebeeck's brother-in-law of Rotterdam, has been entrusted with the task of giving them instructions in the morning and afternoon. Besides his duties of visiting the sick, particularly because he reads Dutch well and correctly, to encourage the slaves to attend and to learn the Christian prayers, it is ordered that after school everyone is to receive a small glass of brandy and 2 inches of tobacco. All their names are to be written down, and those who have none are to be given names, pet or unpet, young or old. All slaves are also being properly clothed to protect them against the daily increase in cold. The strongest have also been put to work so that they may as soon as possible be of service to the settlement. Later in the year, on 6 May 1658, all of the slavers sent by the Herren, the Hasselt, arrived at the Cape from Guinea, bringing with it 228 slaves from Dahomey. These 2 first shiploads of slaves from Angola and Dahomey were, with the exception of a few individuals, the only West African slaves to be brought to the Cape during VOC rule, which almost all of the rest of the VOC slaves coming from Madagascar, the Indian subcontinent or Southeast Asia. On the 29th of March, the Battle of Kambula takes place. The battle involved the British No. 4 column, led by Colonel Evelyn Wood VC, and the Zulu army, led by Ntsingwayo Kamahole. The Zulus had a large numerical advantage over the British, with 2,000 British troops and native levies fighting against some 20,000 Zulus. In the event, however, the British were successful in defeating the Zulus, with Wood's force suffering 83 casualties and the Zulus losing approximately 3,000 men. On the 29th of March 2020, Kalley Township in Cape Town, Western Cape, was the first township to confirm positive case of COVID-19 virus. The Western Cape province was the second province in the number of infected cases, led by Gauteng province. Premier of the Western Cape, Alan Winde, confirmed more than 3,000 cases of COVID-19 in the province. This was an indication that this coronavirus was spreading rapidly within the different communities of the country. According to Windows spokesperson Bianca Capazzorio, the response team was sent to informal settlement to make sure that necessary actions were taken to prevent the spread of the virus. 29 March 1933. Dr. Stanley Magoba is born in Polokwane. Well, Dr. Stanley Magoba, future president of the Pan-Africanist Congress in 1997, was born in Polokwane on this day. He was detained on Robben Island during the 1980s and was appointed as the presiding bishop of the Methodist Church of South Africa in 1998. On 29th of March 1979, Idi Amin Dada Omi fled Uganda. That's a very tricky name. Idi Amin Dada Omi fled Uganda on the 29th of March 1979, first to Libya and eventually to Saudi Arabia. Amin began his career as a cook in the King's African Rifles and British Colonial Army in Uganda in 1956. He distinguished himself as a soldier during campaigns in Burma, Kenya, and Somalia. He was also one of the 2 black Ugandan soldiers to be promoted to the rank of officer in 1961, just before Uganda attained independence. In 1965, Milton Obote, then Prime Minister of Uganda, promoted Amin to the rank of Commander of the Armed Forces. Amin seized power on the 25th of January 1971. While Obote was in Singapore on the 2nd of January 1971, Amin declared himself President of Uganda. Amin's rule was initially welcomed, but the brutality and corruption that he engaged in and the ruthless elimination of anyone that opposed him eventually turned the Ugandan population against him. The final straw was when Amin ordered the Ugandan army to invade Tanzania. Despite being supported by Libyan troops, the Ugandans were sorely trounced. Amin was forced to flee the country when Tanzanian troops took the capital city Kampala. It must be noted also that this date is under dispute, as some sources consider the 11th of April 1977 as the date Amin fled Uganda. On the 19th of March 1982, as a journalist, farm manager, clerk and interpreter and political activist, Henry Shelby Msimang died on the 29th of March 1982 in Edendale, Pietermaritzburg. Msimang was a founding member of the South African Native National Congress SANNC, named the African National Congress in 1923. He was a staunch labor organizer who teamed up with Clemens Kadali to form the National Industrial Commercial Union (ICU). Due to the differences between the two, Msimang resigned as president of the union but rejoined after Kaledi's resignation in 1929. Msimang was editor of the newspaper Morimoa, Inxusa Messenger, and author of numerous articles. He was a founding member of the Liberal Parties of South Africa, LPSA, and Multiracial Party formed in 1953. Msimang was married twice and left behind 4 sons and 4 daughters. On the 29th of March 1990, the African National Congress called off a peace rally to be held within the African Party, a peace rally that was supposed to take place on the 2nd of April in KwaZulu-Natal, but the ANC called it off. The local ANC executive organizer convinced the ANC National Executive that in view of hostility between the two rival parties, which had claimed more than 40 lives in the preceding weeks, a joint rally would pose a serious security problem. The ANC's move was described as a setback to a possible peace settlement. On the 29th of March 1998, British Airways prohibited smoking on all flights. Other countries across the world had begun to impose the first restrictions on smoking in public in the 1970s, but legislation was only applied to airlines during the 1980s. Initially, airline companies were made to separate smoking areas from non-smoking areas on planes, but by the late 1980s, all smoking was prohibited on all flights of less than 2 hours. However, as this entry indicates, smoking was only prohibited on all flights, international and domestic. A decade later, South African Airways prohibited smoking on all flights soon after BA. On the 29th of March 2005, Menenges Kwadze is killed by a crocodile in the Kunene River. Now, Menengi Coetzee and his family had gone to the Kunene River in Namibia on a trip that they had planned for 3 years. The Kunene River is located on the border of Namibia and Angola and has a large population of Nile crocodiles. Menengi and his brother Lucas made their way to the river one night to take a bath when Coetzee was snatched by a crocodile barely 2 minutes after they had entered the water. Lucas tried to rescue his brother, but it was pointless as the crocodile had been too quick in dragging him. The family was distraught and took solace in knowing that Coetzee died in the great outdoors that he so loved. Then on the 29th of March 2005, the third session of the Pan-African Parliament (PAP) began at its temporary home in Kalley Estate in Midrand, north of Johannesburg. The session was opened by its president, Gertrude Mongela. The opening of Parliament coincided with the launch of a PAP website and also marked the first full year of operation since it was launched in 2004 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Part of this podcast I'm going to name it Part 1 of Episode 1 because then I'll be forced to release Part 2 of Episode 1 because I do not want the podcast to be longer than 30 minutes, which is where we are going towards right now. On the 30th of March in history. In 1960, the Security Council begins deliberations on the situation in South Africa. What situation? Under an agenda item entitled "The Situation Arising Out of the Large-Scale Killings of Unarmed and Peaceful Demonstrations Against Racial Discrimination and Segregation in the Union of South Africa." The move by the Security Council followed the event of 21 March 1960, where the Pan-Africanist Congress (PAC) staged an anti-pass demonstration outside Sharpeville Police Station near Vereeniging. They handed over their passes demanding an end to the pass laws. However, the march ended in tragedy when the police opened fire on the marchers, killing 69 people and injuring close to 200 in what has come to be known as the Sharpeville Massacre. 30 March 1990, Nelson Mandela of the African National Congress (ANC) and the Mongasuthu Buthelezi Inkatha Freedom Party (IFP) met to negotiate an ending to violence in townships. The political camps had been engaged in violence since the early 1980s. Now this was a very historic movement, as today we know that the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party are at peace, or at least appears. On the 30th of March 1998, enriched in the South African Bill of Rights is the right to free access to information. In this spirit, the Independent Commission's Authority of South Africa granted Media Television a free-to-air broadcasting license. This license was awarded on the 30th of March 1998, and the channel, which has to be ETV, began broadcasting in October of this year. This effectively created competition for South African Broadcasting Corporation in terms of revenue streams derived from advertising. This act also demonstrated the government's willingness to defend the South African Constitution and the media freedom, thereby avoiding the utilization of one public broadcaster as a means to disseminate propaganda, as the apartheid government had done. Thank you for being with me until the end of this podcast. As I said, I did not want to make the podcast way too long, so I'm just going to leave them at this. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please do subscribe, like, so that you do not miss any video. First of all, when you subscribe, make sure that you turn on the notification button so that you don't miss a single video. And when you like, it helps grow the channel, it helps people discover the channel, or it helps the channel discover people, I guess. So please do subscribe and leave a like, only if you enjoyed today's podcast. And until I see you again, which probably is to be next week, Monday, where I'll be releasing the second part of this episode. So please do stay tuned. And until then, adios, muchachos.